Good evening. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Mark Lambert, and I'm joined on this episode by a good friend of mine, Matt Gaspers, who's the former managing editor of Catholic Family News. Those of you in America might recognise him. He's very well known on the more sort of traditional circuit as a commentator, and you sort of get on well with 1 Peter 5 and all those guys, don't you, Matt?
Yeah, 1 Peter 5, LifeSite News, good friends and allies in our common fight. And I must say it was very nice to meet you and Gavin and Catherine at the Catholic Identity Conference a few months ago. That was great.
Yeah, it was great occasion, wasn't it? So we thought we'd get together this evening and just have a chat about some of the things that you're particularly interested in, which revolves around the prophecies of Fatima, doesn't it? You actually given some talks on it, Matt, haven't you?
Yeah, and I always find it whenever something happens in the Middle East, like we've seen recently in Syria, it kind of rekindles my interest in that subject and its connections with the prophecies of Our Lady of Fatima. So I guess before I started with CFN and afterwards, I gave some talks for the Fatima at a couple of Fatima Center conferences. One in 2016 called the Fatima, Islam, and Our Lady's Coming Triumph, which the Fatima Center published in this booklet form, and it's available on their website. If you search like Matt Gasper's Fatima Islam in Google, it'll come up the PDF. And then a year later, 2017, I gave kind of a part two to that called The End of Islam, Russia's Future Role, which I know is a very dramatic and ambitious title. The end of, can we actually hope for the end of Islam? And I'll share with you the source for that title comes from, I think, one of the volumes of Dom Guéranger's The Liturgical Year, towards the end of the series. That's a great series for devotional reading each day of the liturgical year according to the traditional Latin Mass calendar. So on November 14th, in the 15th and final volume of that series, for the feast of St. Josaphat Kunchevich, who was a Ruthenian Catholic archbishop, and he helped bring Ruthenian, like Orthodox souls, like in Belarus, for example, north of Ukraine, back into communion with Rome in his day. He was martyred for his efforts in 1623. So commenting on his life and connections with Russia, we read the following on his feast day. Russia becoming Catholic would mean an end to Islamism, which I think is basically the equivalent of Islam or Mohammedanism. Excuse me. And the definitive triumph of the cross upon the Bosphorus, meaning Asia Minor or modern-day Turkey, which was the center of the Islamic Ottoman Empire. And it goes on to say, without any danger to Europe, the Christian empire in the East restored, with a glory and power hitherto unknown, Asia evangelized, not by a few poor isolated priests, but with the help of an authority greater than that of Charlemagne. And lastly, the Slavonic race brought into unity of faith and aspirations for its own greater glory. This transformation will be the greatest event of the century that shall see its accomplishment. It will change the face of the world. Is there any foundation for such hopes? And I can't remember when it was that I first found this quote, but obviously to answer the rhetorical question, is there any foundation for such hopes? I immediately thought, well, absolutely there is, because of what Our Lady of Fatima said in 1917, that in the end my Immaculate Heart will triumph, the Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and it shall be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. And I am one who holds that the consecration of Russia has still not been done properly. Pope Francis got closer than most of his predecessors in March of 2022, but when he actually explicitly named Russia and Ukraine in that consecration ceremony, but he didn't actually fulfill certain other requirements that Our Lady spoke about when she explained it to Sister Lucia in 1929, the oldest of the three Fatima seers, the only one who lived a full life. Our Lady returned and appeared to her again in 1929 and said, "The moment has come when God asks the Holy Father, and in union with him all the bishops of the Catholic Church, to consecrate Russia." So a couple points there to unpack, if I could. First of all, the reason why I hold that Pope Francis's consecration didn't pass the requirements, so to speak. Well, first of all, we obviously haven't seen a miraculous conversion of Russia since March of 2022. And it's important to understand what Our Lady meant when she said conversion, because a lot of people over the years have thought that must have meant the fall of communism, the Soviet Union, whatever, which a lot of people actually have pretty convincingly argued that the so-called collapse of the Soviet Union was more of like a controlled demolition as a means of deceiving the West, and that communist ideology, Soviet ideology, the spirit of communism still lives on in Russia today under Putin. But we have this very important quote from the former official Fatima archivist who served in that role for about 16 years ago. His name is Father Joaquin Alonso, and he had many lengthy discussions with Sister Lucia during his tenure as the archivist. And he wrote the following in his book, The Truth About the Secret of Fatima. That's referring to the message of Our Lady given on July 13th, 1917. And here's what he says in his book. Lucia has always thought that the conversion of Russia does not extend only to a return of the Russian people to the Christian Orthodox religion, while rejecting the Marxist atheism of the Soviets, but that it refers simply and fully to the total and integral conversion by a return to the unique and true Roman Catholic Church. But what I like to remind people of is that in order for Russia to come back into Catholic unity, it doesn't mean that they have to become Roman Rite. They could certainly preserve their Eastern liturgy and traditions in that sense, but they do need to come, in order to be truly converted, the Russian Orthodox Church and the nation of Russia needs to, come out of their state of schism and re-enter communion with the Pope, with the Vicar of Christ. So
we
that
seem
is what
quite far away from that at the moment, don't we?
Yeah, certainly, and to be fair, I guess I would be, if I was in their shoes, I have to say I would probably be hesitant about coming into communion with Pope Francis at this moment.
Pope Francis has probably done more for the Orthodox than any other pope in history, hasn't he?
Right.
I think more and more people are converting to Orthodoxy. Right. And do you think, so perhaps like our audience on Catholic Unscripted is not just Catholic. We have, a large sort of Anglican audience and people who aren't sure and stuff like that. So perhaps we should do a basic rundown on what Fatima is and what we're talking about. Because It is quite extraordinary and it brings a lot of people to faith, Matt, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that the two biggest influences on me as a young man, like in the, early 2000s when I was like junior, senior in high school, and then going into my first couple years of college, learning about the message of Fatima together with learning about the traditional Latin Mass really built me up tremendously in the faith and really got me serious about practicing the faith as an adult. So essentially, when we say Fatima, it refers to a village in the nation of Portugal where the Mother of God, the Blessed Virgin Mary, appeared 6 times over the course of 6 months throughout the year 1917. So the year before the end of the First World War, to kind of give people a historical context. So it was on May 13th of that year, 1917, that she first appeared to 3 shepherd children. They were tending their flock, literally, kind of like the angel. We're in Advent right now. It's reminiscent of the angel that appeared to the shepherds, keeping watch during the night, proclaiming that the birth of Christ had happened. So Our Lady appeared, and she appeared on the 3rd. She said she would come back again the next month on the 13th day, and that's what happened over the course of several months. So May 13th, June 13th, July 13th, which was a particularly important apparition because she entrusted to the children what she referred to as a secret. She told them not to share it with anyone. And it was divided into 3 parts, which, decades later, Sister Lucia, the oldest of the 3 children, the 2 younger ones, Francisco and Jacinta, were her cousins. And they, as Our Lady explained to them, God's plan for the 2 younger ones was to offer lots of prayers and sacrifices and to be taken to heaven soon after those apparitions, which came to pass. I forget the exact years of their deaths, but they died in childhood, both of them. But God had a different plan for Lucia, as Our Lady explained, that in God's plan, she was kind of to be the apostle of Our Lady of Fatima, so to speak, to stay on earth and promote the message throughout the rest of her long life. So Our Lady appeared, May, June, July, August. There was a little bit of a hiccup, so to speak, with the apparition because the children were actually kidnapped by the Freemasonic mayor of the larger town Orem, in which Fatima
built a bit of a following, hadn't they? People were...
Yes. So each month, the word started to spread, even without social media. The word of mouth back in those days spread very quickly, and it went from having maybe dozens of people coming to the apparition one month to hundreds the next month to eventually to thousands. And the local authorities were getting very concerned because they were very anti-Catholic. They were Masons and they were communists, and they didn't want this kind of thing happening under their watch. So the mayor of Orem kidnapped the children. He made it look like he was just offering them a ride to the apparition site, this big open field called the Cova de Iria, which was owned by Lucia's father. But he ended up taking them in the opposite direction to his place, throwing them in prison, basically threatening to boil them in oil unless they revealed the secret to him, which they refused to do. And it's a very strong proof for the authenticity of the messages because when you threaten a child with a spanking, if they're telling a lie, they're probably going to fess up. So threatening them with martyrdom and then still refusing to say what they had been told by Our Lady is a pretty strong proof in favor of the authenticity of the message. So ultimately, all of this culminated on October 13th of 1917, when Our Lady performed by the power of God, of course, working through her, she performed a miracle of biblical proportions, which was witnessed from miles away, also by a crowd of around 70,000 people, at least 70,000, where they saw
documented in the newspaper, wasn't it? So
correct.
Atheists, it wasn't all religious people who saw it.
Oh, correct. If you search "Miracle of the Sun Fatima" on Google or whatever, you'll see the original newspaper headlines in the local Freemasonic, like anti-Catholic, anti-clerical newspaper O Seculo, which had it on its front page featured, and pictures from the event. There's also a book written by John Hafford called "Meet the Witnesses," which is a great source for that. He went over to Fatima and interviewed eyewitnesses of the miracle, so it's very well attested. Anyone who claims that it was like mass hysteria is just delusional or lying, one of the two. So yeah, for a period of about 10 to 12 minutes, this huge crowd of 70,000 people, and as I mentioned, it was also witnessed by others from many miles away, saw the sun, what people described as dancing in the sky, or kind of moving erratically in the sky, and emitting, like spinning in on itself and emitting all the colors of the rainbow that were reflected on the people. The other main thing about the miracle is that the whole previous night it had been raining, like pouring rain in this field. People were walking up to their ankles in this mud because it had just been raining so much that the field was flooded. By the end of this miracle, during which some people also received miraculous cures, I think that's also documented in Mr. Hafford's book from the eyewitnesses. At the end of this miracle, the sun, the description was like it detached itself from its place in the sky and seemed to plummet down towards the people. People fell to their knees, freaking out, thinking it was the end of the world, confessing their sins, and people being converted on the spot to God and the faith. And then the sun went back up into its quote unquote normal place in the sky, and people realized they were completely clean and dry, and the ground was completely dry. And I know there have been some scientists who talk about the amount of energy needed to accomplish that is the equivalent of several nuclear weapons, which should have incinerated everyone in that field. And yet nobody was harmed at all. So it really is, that's why I say it's of biblical proportions. Not only that, it was predicted by Our Lady 3 months in advance. And that's why there was such a huge crowd, because the children said, Our Lady's going to work a miracle so that you will believe. That's why Sister Lucia asked that Our Lady do that. So because a lot of people were saying, oh, you're just making this up. You're just trying to get attention or whatever. Even her own parents, even her own mother in particular, was staunchly against the apparitions until she saw the miracle for herself. So
how do we know that, like, this is private revelation, isn't it? So from a Catholic point of view, revelation finished with the death of the last apostle. So we're not obliged to take this on board, but the church has accepted the miracle, hasn't it? It has accepted Fatima as
and I think
valid.
As my understanding, and I've been studying this for several years now, Fatima has received more official approbations from the church, from the popes, since it happened, more than any other apparition that has been approved in history. I mean, it's, on one occasion, I forget the exact date, but I know that John Paul II, during either a homily or a speech on the subject of Fatima, basically said the message of Fatima, because it's inseparable from the gospel message itself and really the Catholic faith, imposes an obligation on the church. So that's how seriously he took it.
Yeah.
And
so these are the things, aren't they, that it always, Our Lady always points us to Jesus.
Yes.
That's fundamental in these apparitions and their authenticity, isn't it? Is that Our Lady is always pointing us to Jesus, and that there's nothing new revealed, really. It's all from the gospel, isn't it?
Correct. And Father Nicholas Gruner, who passed away in 2015, he led the Fatima Center for many years. He used to explain to people that, yes, Fatima is technically a private revelation, and obviously doesn't add anything to the deposit of faith of public revelation, which is scripture and tradition. But given the nature of the message, and also the fact that God himself gave his stamp of approval through that unprecedented miracle, it really qualifies as what Father Gruner used to call a public prophetic message meant for the entire world, for all of humanity. And as St. Thomas Aquinas explains in the Summa, one of the purposes of prophecy is not only to reveal something new or hidden, like to predict the future or something, but it's also to direct human acts in the present. And Our Lady did, talk about several requests. Let me pull up in a tab here. I'll pull up the Vatican published a document in the year 2000 called The Message of Fatima, which gives kind of an overview of what happened, and then specifically this, what I call the most important message on July 13th of 1917. Our Lady gave what is commonly called the secret of Fatima, or it's sometimes people refer to the third secret, because it's the message that day was divided into 3 parts. The first part was a vision of hell, a very graphic vision, which, obviously startled the children terribly. And Sister Lucia wrote in her memoirs that if Our Lady had not already promised them that they were going to heaven, they would have died of fright, I think was her language. So this is what Our Lady said in the second part of the message, immediately following the vision of hell. She said, "You have seen hell, where the souls of poor sinners go. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart, because, as you just mentioned, devotion to Our Lady naturally leads us to Jesus, as St. Louis de Montfort explains at length in his treatise, True Devotion to Mary. Mary is the quickest way to Jesus, basically, to sum it up. So she went on to say, if what I say to you is done, so she did come to ask for specific things, many souls will be saved and there will be peace. The war, referring to World War I, is going to end, but if people do not cease offending God, a worse one will break out during the pontificate of Pius XI. So she actually prophesied the name of a future pope in the year 1917. Our Lady said, when you see a night illuminated by an unknown light, which actually happened, I believe it was January 25th of 1938, know that this is the great sign given you by God that he is about to punish the world for its crimes by means of war, famine, and persecutions of the Church and of the Holy Father. To prevent this, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart. Now, kind of humorously reflecting on that as an adult, Lucia explained that at the time, hearing that they had never heard of the nation of Russia, they didn't know what that meant. As children living in Portugal, they actually thought that it was some kind of a wicked woman living like in a neighboring village or something, so that was their context. But Our Lady said she would come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays of the month. That's another big part of the message of Our Lady of Fatima, receiving Holy Communion in a state of grace on the first Saturday of the month, with the intention of making reparation to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. So Our Lady said, if my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the Church. And this is before the communist revolution. We should keep in mind she's also basically prophesying about the October, what would happen in October of 1917 with the Bolshevik revolution and the takeover of the nation of Russia by the communists. She went on to say, the good will be martyred, the Holy Father will have much to suffer, various nations will be annihilated. That's something else prophetic that I don't think we've actually seen the full fulfillment of yet, in my opinion anyway. But ultimately, she ended the second part of the secret by saying, in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me. And notice she always talks specifically and exclusively about Russia, not the entire world or Russia and Ukraine or or the Church or whatever. Russia is always singled out as the exclusive object of the consecration. So she says, the Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me. She shall be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. So
seeing as we're in this situation at the moment with, as you pointed out earlier, Russian expansionism seems to be prevalent, like that idea that Putin sees the Russian, like the Soviet Empire, if you like. He's trying to recreate the Soviet Empire in some respects. And the fact that all of Our Lady's predictions have come true, you start thinking about this again at times like this, don't you? And thinking, well, what can we learn from this?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I also think of, the connection to Islam in regard to Fatima. The village in Portugal named Fatima was actually named after a princess. I think I quote from this. Archbishop Sheen wrote a book called The World's First Love many years ago. Archbishop Fulton Sheen, some of your viewers are probably familiar with his name. And he explained
We're always banging on about him on here.
Yes. So this is what he explains in The World's First Love, which was originally published in 1952. He recounts how during the medieval reconquista of Spain and Portugal from the occupying Muslim forces, he says, quote, the last Muslim chief had a beautiful daughter by the name of Fatima, named after the daughter of Muhammad, the prophet, his favorite daughter. Well, I should say the false prophet, Muhammad. A Catholic boy fell in love with her, and for him, she not only stayed behind when the Muslims left, but even embraced the faith. The young husband was so much in love with her that he changed the name of the town where he lived to Fatima. Thus, the very place where Our Lady appeared in 1917 bears a historical connection to Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad. And Sheen goes on in that book to make some very interesting observations regarding the conversion of Muslims and Our Lady of Fatima. So he says, let me see. Okay, here we go. It is our firm belief, says Archbishop Sheen, that the fears some entertain concerning the Muslims are not to be realized, but that Islam instead will eventually be converted to Christianity, and in a way that even some of our missionaries never suspect. It is our belief that this will happen not through the direct teaching of Christianity, but through a summoning of Muslims to a veneration of the Mother of God. And he explains that, there is a sort of veneration, a devotion to Mary, even among Muslims. She's held in high regard among them. And there's even a verse in the Quran that celebrates her. This is from the Quran. It says, "O Mary, Allah has chosen you and purified you and elected you above all the women of the earth." Now, obviously, there are serious problems with Islam and the teaching of the Quran, which, is heretical and blasphemous against the Trinity and our Lord. But there are some, kernels of truth, I guess you could say, about Mary in that sense.
Yeah, if you study the Quran, it's clear that Muhammad knew a bit of the Bible when he sort of mixed it up with mixed up the Old Testament and the New Testament a bit and chucked in some stuff about how many wives he could have and
yes,
the people he liked and the people he didn't like, and Bob's your uncle and Fanny's your aunt. Right. There you go.
Yeah, it's a very weird mishmash of, like you say, of Old Testament, New Testament, probably some pagan elements in Arabia at his time, and the revelations he claimed to have received. But anyway, Archbishop Sheen makes this crucial connection between the conversion of Muslims and Our Lady of Fatima. He says, "Mary then is for the Muslims the true Sayyida or lady." And he says, "Missionaries in the future will more and more see that their apostolate among the Muslims will be successful in the measure that they preach Our Lady of Fatima. For this reason that," he says, I'll back up a little bit, "since nothing ever happens out of heaven except with a finesse of all details, I believe that the Blessed Virgin chose to be known as Our Lady of Fatima as a pledge and a sign of hope to the Muslim people, and as an assurance that they who show her so much respect will one day accept her divine Son too. So she will lead the Muslims to Jesus and ultimately to the Catholic faith." And I found in my research that this also aligns with some other, again, they're private revelations or prophecies. Catholics are not obliged to believe them, but there is something that is common amongst writers like Venerable Mary of Agreda, who wrote The Mystical City of God, also St. Louis de Montfort in True Devotion to Mary, and some other sources. They talk about a coming age of Mary towards, like, not the end of the world, like, the second coming of Christ is imminent, but an age of peace prior to that, prior to the arrival and the rise of the Antichrist, in which there will be this spiritual renewal of the church and of Christendom. So in the civil and in the ecclesiastical spheres, we'll see this miraculous renaissance of Catholic faith and morals. And integral to that is the reign of Mary, which ultimately ushers in the reign of Jesus. And interestingly, both Mary of Agreda and Louis de Montfort talk about, they mention her power over the Muslims during this period. And I'll give you a couple examples. So Mary of Agreda wrote, "The power of Mary in the latter days will be very conspicuous. Mary will extend the reign of Christ over the heathens and the Mohammedans, and it will be a time of great joy when Mary is enthroned as Mistress and Queen of Hearts." And Louis de Montfort likewise says in True Devotion to Mary, "She will extend the kingdom of Christ over the idolaters and Muslims, and there will come a glorious era in which Mary will be the ruler and queen of human hearts." And he also says, "Mary must shine forth more than ever in mercy, in might, and in grace in these latter times," in this period of peace and glory before the coming of the Antichrist and the final persecution before our Lord comes again. And he explains in might against the enemies of God, idolaters, schismatics, Mohammedans, Jews, and souls hardened in impiety. So all of this kind of collectively leads me to believe that Our Lady is certainly going to play a very decisive role in some sort of a miraculous conversion of Muslim people towards the end. And I see all of this very much through the lens of the message of Our Lady of Fatima. And
Have you heard the stories? There are lots of stories at the moment, aren't there, of Muslims having visions of Our Lady. Have you heard about that?
I have heard of that. I've also heard of accounts of Muslims having visions of Jesus, and I think for Muslims of goodwill, they are certainly very ripe for conversion. Those who are maybe not so infected with the ideology of jihad and all of that stuff. Yeah.
I was going to say theologically, like for if anyone's watching and they sort of go, oh, Catholics always on about Mary, from a theological perspective. So here we've got sort of a mystical perspective and how that's fed into the world historically, etc. But also from a theological perspective, if you go back, I'm sort of involved in Bible study with some Baptist brothers and sisters, and we often look at these things. It's funny the way that they don't seem to have read some certain bits of the Bible, or with selective hearing. And when you point out, that Scripture says, henceforth all generations will call me blessed, or the way that Elizabeth greets our Blessed Mother, and theologically, of course, the Christological councils, it was all about Our Lady and the Theotokos, the God-bearer. That was the sign of orthodoxy in the early church, wasn't it? So
correct.
If you understand like Mary, then you understand Christology, and that was the way the church fathers saw it. So it might seem a bit unusual to our separated brothers and sisters, but it's not really, is it? It's something that's been in the church from the very first. It's and if you understand that, through the incarnation, you've got this extraordinary connection between us and God, and that's the important thing that Mary teaches us how that works, really, doesn't she? Through the communication of idioms and this sort of thing.
Absolutely. And I think the whole theology, I love the theology, which is very ancient, going back to, as early as like Saint Irenaeus of Lyon in the 2nd century, talking about Eve, or Our Lady as being the new Eve, and our Lord as being the new Adam. I mean, that's our Lord as the new Adam is explicit in Scripture, but the early church fathers take the analogy further and make it explicit that just as Jesus is the new Adam, Mary is the new Eve. Yeah.
So what is Our Lady then? This was a period of time which seems to have slowed down a little bit now, doesn't it, in these days, where we had lots of visions. There was, La Salette, there was the one in Spain that Gavin loves. I can't remember what it's called now.
Oh, probably Garabandal.
Yeah, Garabandal. Lourdes. There were lots of different apparitions. What was Our Lady doing, and why has she stopped doing it?
Well, that's a good question.
Big question.
I don't know if I can probably can't give a definitive answer on that. I mean, I guess my perspective
what are your ideas?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that there's still a lot of what I've heard referred to as Fatima's unfinished business. I think there's a lot connected with the message that she gave in Fatima, which is obviously very well attested, both, by the church, confirming that there's nothing against Catholic faith or morals in the message, but also the fact of the miracle that God himself gave his stamp of approval in that really unprecedented way. So as I mentioned earlier in our discussion, I think the consecration of Russia has to be done in a very particular way in order for it to have its proper effects. I wrote, after Pope Francis did his consecration ceremony on March 25th, 2022, and that was in response to to a request made by the Ukrainian bishops, obviously in the context of the war, the Russia-Ukraine war. So this is what Pope Francis said on that occasion. He said, And this is just the relevant couple of sentences in his longer act of consecration. So he said, "Therefore, Mother of God and our Mother, to your Immaculate Heart we solemnly entrust and consecrate ourselves, the Church, and all humanity, especially Russia and Ukraine. Accept this act that we carry out with confidence and love. Grant that war may end and peace spread throughout the world." So, as I said earlier, he did a better job than some of his predecessors in the sense that first of all, he actually used the word consecrate, which is important. That word is important, especially in Catholic theology. It means, obviously, like in the context of the Mass, the consecration is when the elements are transubstantiated, as we would say, into the body and blood of Christ. They are set aside and made holy by God. And he also explicitly said Russia, especially Russia and Ukraine. But as I said earlier, and I read from the actual words of Our Lady recorded by Sister Lucia, Our Lady said that she would come to ask for the consecration of Russia. And I think the reason for that, as I explained in the talk I gave in 2017, The End of Islam, Russia's Future Role, I do believe that God has a special plan for Russia to use Russia as a vessel of election, to use a scriptural term, similar to how he used St. Paul, who prior to his radical conversion had been a persecutor of the church, the worst one. He was feared among the Christians, we read in the Acts of the Apostles. And even when our Lord appeared to, I think it was Ananias, Ananias was like, I'm paraphrasing, "Lord, are you sure you want me to go see this man? Do you not know what he's doing to your people, how he's terribly persecuting them?" And that's when our Lord said, he is a vessel of election for the conversion of the Gentiles, something like that. And I think this is Acts chapter 9. And I believe very firmly that God has a similar, an analogous plan for the nation of Russia that has horribly persecuted the church in recent decades. Even going back centuries prior to the Soviet era. Something I get into in my 2017 talk is that there's a centuries-long, very deeply embedded anti-Catholicism in Russian history and culture, even apart from communism. So the conversion of that nation in particular will be uniquely spectacular because of its anti-Catholic history. And the reason why I think it fits in with, the end of Islam, as we read in that quote from Guéranger's The Liturgical Year, Russia, specifically during the Soviet era, but even continuing under Putin, has some connections to furthering, kind of co-opting Islam and using it to further its own agenda. Because Islam is, there are verses in the Quran, as I'm sure many people know, that are talk about jihad or holy war, very violent, and even against Jews and Christians, which are called people of the book in the Quran, that Muslims are even supposed to fight against people of the book if they refuse to convert or be subjected to Islamic rule.
There's a chronological teleology. Perhaps it's useful to point that out, because often when you talk about these things, you'll find that apologists for Islam will say, "Oh no," and they'll quote opposite verses that say,
Right.
that Muslims respect the people of the book and all this sort of thing.
Right.
And basically, what happened was when Muhammad. So I'm not making this up. This is the actual facts of the matter. Mm-hmm. When Muhammad didn't have any friends, when he was trying to gather apostles, when he was trying to followers, he was very, gentle with everyone. And then later on, when he built up an army, it was all about going to war. And so the development of Islam is very much, as they got stronger, it became increasingly violent. And of course, Muhammad was killed in the end, and it all descended into infighting, which is why we've got Sunni and Shia and Ahmadi and all these different sects today.
Exactly right. Yeah, that earlier period was when he was originally preaching in Mecca, and he was preaching to Jews especially, but also there were some Christians around. And when they said, thanks but no thanks, then they ended up basically running him out of town, as I understand it, from what I've studied. And he went to another city called Medina, And that's when he started preaching jihad and gathering soldiers to his cause. And
Yeah.
then they made their famous
They went
first
back to Mecca.
pilgrimage, the Hajj.
Yeah.
So that's where, another interesting topic that fits into all of this is the topic of immigration, whether legal or illegal. And I know both of our countries, but I think yours in particular, the United Kingdom, has really been overrun by, Muslim immigrants. And I'm not saying that all of them are, of malicious intent. Some of them, I'm sure, are just trying to make a better life for themselves and their families. But there's no doubt that there are some among them who definitely have an agenda. It's not just about fleeing in order to have a better life. It's about...
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think that, like, obviously, so it's not quite as bad as I think it's often made out to be in the States. They're still a real minority. And, I've got quite a few Muslim friends who are great friends and wonderful people. As you say, people are just people, aren't they? And,
right.
If you break bread with them and you find that you've got more in common than you haven't got in common.
Right.
But at the same time, the difference with that we find with Muslims is that they tend to segregate themselves. So everyone else, the UK is really made up of immigrants. It is much like America, I suppose. It is that waves of immigration from the the Saxons and the Normans and the Romans and everyone all the way till 1066 when the Normans invaded. No one since then, though. Thank goodness. But now we're sort of seeing a new wave of invasion. And what you tend to find is that they form a little enclave and they don't integrate themselves into society. And that's become problematic because they're trying to enforce Sharia law and in their own little areas and stuff like that. So
right.
It definitely is a challenge. For me, it's very much about culture, that we live in a Christian culture in the UK, and that's not compatible with Islamic ideals and Sharia law. And so we often find that we make common ground with Muslims on things like the transgender issue, say, for example, but ultimately there are such massive theological differences between the two ideologies that it has to be one or the other. And indeed, Islam does teach that in the end, we'll either all convert or we'll be killed. So there's no... there's no easy way out of this, really, is there?
Right.
And I think also we have a duty, haven't we, as Catholics, to say this is the truth. What we hold is divinely revealed truth, and it works. It works because we've built Western civilization, the greatest civilization that's ever existed, and we need to understand that, value it, and argue for it, don't we?
Something else I wanted to mention, I find this fascinating. Maybe some of your viewers will as well. I think you will. That there's a lot of overlap between even pre-communist Russian culture and politics, statecraft, and Islam. And that's another connection that I see. Like, that's God in His providence wants to use Russia as after it's converted, as a means of converting the rest of the world. Especially the Muslims, because when I say an end to Islam, I want to make sure people understand that we're not talking about like a violent Christian version of jihad where we're wiping Muslims off the face of the earth. That's not what we're talking about at all.
No.
We're talking about a miraculous conversion, just like what happened as a result of the apparitions of Our Lady of Guadalupe, as you see behind me. That image ended up contributing to the conversion of millions of indigenous Mexicans, pagans, Aztecs.
Beautifully as well. Incredible. Yeah. That's another incredible thing that people should look into if they're interested.
Absolutely right. There's a great documentary that came out in the States several years ago that's very fascinating, called The Blood and the Rose. I think it's available online, I think, to watch the whole thing, or you can rent it or something. But it actually goes in to explain that the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, before I get into this Russia stuff, a lot of people don't realize that the image, or the title rather, of Our Lady of Guadalupe actually predates the apparitions of Our Lady in Mexico in 1531. It goes back to like the end of the conquistador era in Spain, like in the 1200s, 1300s in Extremadura. There's a famous statue that the conquistadores, when they're fighting the Moors, trying to get trying to take back their land after centuries of occupation by Islamic forces. They found this statue. It was buried. I can't remember the full story, but I think it has a connection to Saint James the Greater, who evangelized Spain, in the first century, and he became known as the Moor Slayer. Like the Moors would see visions of him fighting on the side of the Christian forces and were terrified, that kind of thing, because it was obviously God's will that Spain once again be Christian lands, part of Christendom. So even with Our Lady of Guadalupe, I see a connection to Islam with, the moon under her feet. Obviously, the crescent moon is a very prominent symbol of Islam. So when I was coming up with these talks years ago, I had a verse from the Psalms come to mind in regard to the triumph of Our Lady's Immaculate Heart. It's from Psalm 71 in the Douay-Rheims numbering, or 72 in newer versions, but it's one of the messianic prophecies in the Psalms ultimately about our Lord Jesus Christ. But there's a part of Psalm 71 verse 7, which says that the true King of Israel will reign till the moon be taken away. And I thought that was interesting, that I see in that possibly a reference to this end of Islam that we've been talking about. But I wanted to share with you a little bit of this research I've done about the very, very strong and virulent anti-Catholicism really inherent in Russian history. So I came across a historian. He used to teach at, I think it was University in Texas, Dr. Dennis J. Dunn. He's written a couple of books on Russian history and Catholicism. He himself is a Catholic. So he says in his 2004 book, The Catholic Church and Russia, Popes, Patriarchs, Tsars, and Commissars, he says, Catholicism is at the heart of Western civilization. It produced a value system that was in fundamental conflict with the Russian authoritarian tradition. He's referring to Tsarist absolutism, which has resulted in clashes between Russia and the West. And again, this was even way before the advent of the Soviet Union. He goes on to say, of course, there are many reasons for the historical tension between Russia and the West, including political and personal rivalries, security threats, territorial disputes, etc., etc. There are also periods when Russia and the West have cooperated, for example, against the Turks in the 17th century or against the Nazis in the 20th century. But ultimately, he says the primary relationship between Russia and the West is one of hostility. And the principal reason for this is the clash of Western values. And I'm not talking about like current modern woke values. I'm talking about traditional Western values, like the values of the Catholic faith, in other words, which he says were fashioned in part by the Catholic Church. So the clash of those values with the Russian authoritarian tradition, formed by historical and geographical circumstances, but once crystallized, was unalterably committed to any abrogation or challenge to its power. And I also came across this interesting quote from Vladimir Putin himself, who, viewers may be, I'm sure everyone's familiar with his name, but he has a long history. He served in the KGB for many years, the Soviet foreign intelligence, the secret police, basically, very nasty fellows. And he also is a big fan of Joseph Stalin. As I understand it, he's publicly criticized and even removed some of the monuments to Lenin. He's not a fan of Leninism, but he is a big fan of Stalinism because he and Stalin were both very much Russian nationalists. And Putin has also talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think I have the quote here. In 2005, he referred to it as the, quote, the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Because he loves the motherland, he loves Russia, and I think he also wants to see it dominant once again, which is why he does what he does in some ways.
That's part of his argument for invading Ukraine as well, wasn't it? Was that it belonged, Kiev belonged to Russia.
Right. So in 2010, during a speech in December of that year, he said the following, and I recently posted this on my my Twitter or my X feed in connection with video footage. Many people probably don't know about this, but so Putin visited Chechnya, a particularly Muslim Islamic region in Russia, earlier this year, and he appointed many years ago the longtime president or leader of that area. It's kind of a weird, like, quasi-autonomous zone in Russia. It's also known for a lot of terrorist activity, Chechen terrorists. So Putin visited there in August of this year, and he was given a gold-plated copy of the Quran, and he actually held it up to his mouth and kissed it. And people might be shocked by that, thinking, well, I thought, Putin was this champion of Russian Orthodoxy, a serious Christian or whatever, which I kind of find humorous. I don't know how people can believe that personally, but so in 2010, he said, during this speech that he gave, Russia was initially formed as a multinational and multi-confessional state. We have Eastern Christianity, in other words, Orthodoxy, and some theorists say that it is much closer to Islam than Catholicism is. And as I say in my post, which is based on what I wrote in this 2017 speech, in terms of theology, this notion is, of course, absurd. Thinking that Islam is, or that Orthodoxy is closer to Islam than it is to Catholicism, because Islam rejects fundamental truths of the Christian faith, like the Trinity and the divinity of Christ. But politically speaking, Orthodoxy and Islam are, in fact, very closely related. And this is something that Professor Dunn discusses at length in another book he wrote, this one published in 2016, called A History of Orthodox, Islamic, and Western Christian Political Values. It's a very fascinating book. And essentially, he demonstrates how Orthodoxy and Islam agree on the following points. Number one, that the church or the mosque and the state should be virtually a single entity. So in Orthodoxy, the state controls the church, and that was the case even before communism. The Russian czars have long controlled the Russian Orthodox Church, part of the Caesaro-Papist tradition in the East, an unfortunate tradition, which basically holds the civil leader as the supreme authority, which is not biblical and not according to the fathers of the church. That should be the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. So on point number two, the ruler's power in whether it be in the church or the state should be absolute, beyond scrutiny from subordinates. Number three, government should be centralized and admit of no self-direction for local communities. In other words, it should be very totalitarian. Number four, the community as a whole always trumps the individual or smaller groups within society, so it's very collectivist in nature. And number five, the central government should control the economy. So again, this is based on the worldview of Orthodoxy and Islam, these 5 points. And notice how these values also align with communism. Very interesting. Very interesting.
Very interesting, yeah.
And the other connection that I see, as far as Russia and Islam, something that I've learned about from a Soviet-era defector. He died a couple of years ago, Ion Mihai Pacepa. He was a lieutenant general in communist Romania, and he wrote this book, I think it was in 2013, Disinformation. It's a very fascinating read. And he talks about basically in the 1970s, Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB at the time, started thinking, we can harness, well, it goes back before him, but we can harness the jihadist elements of Islam to be a very potent ally for us in our common cause against the West, which is what they started doing. So Pacepa explains in his book, let's see here. So here we go. This is from, I have a transcript of my talk as my notes here while we're discussing. So Pachepa wrote in his book, by 1972, Andropov's disinformation machinery was working around the clock to persuade the Islamic world that Israel and the United States intended to transform the rest of the world into a Zionist fiefdom. According to Andropov, the Islamic world was a petri dish in which the KGB community could nurture a virulent strain of America hatred grown from the bacterium of Marxist-Leninist thought. And he also observes that Islamic anti-Semitism ran deep. And as I would say as a comment, all the way back really to Muhammad himself, because the Jews of his day rejected his claim of being a prophet, and he was very resentful of that. Pachepa also explains in his book, in 1972, Andropov launched Operation CIG, which stands for Zionist Governments in Russia. This was the code name for a socialist division of labor aimed at turning the Islamic world into an explosive enemy of the United States. The Romanian DIE, that's what he was in charge of, the equivalent of Romania's KGB, their sphere of influence for the operation embraced Libya, Iran, Lebanon, and Syria, interestingly. So his task as head of foreign intelligence in Romania was to scour the country for trusted Communist Party activists belonging to Islamic ethnic groups, train them in disinformation and terrorist operations, and infiltrate them into its target countries, which apparently included Syria.
Terrifying.
So it's another interesting connection with the current situation in Syria is that, as we were talking before we started the show, I said, I'm sure you remember the London bombings in 2005, that terrorist attack, and the group Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for it. Well, interestingly, in his book, this disinformation book, Pachepa explains that a KGB defector, KGB, which became the FSB after the fall of the Soviet Union, which Putin, by the way, was in charge of for many years. He was the head of that organization. There was a KGB defector named Alexander Litvinenko who he was granted asylum in the UK. He resided in London. And shortly after that bombing in 2005, it was July of 2005, he revealed in a public interview, and this is what Pachepa says in his book, he revealed some earth-shattering KGB/FSB secrets to the British Foreign Intelligence Service, MI6. One of those secrets, which became public, was that Ayman al-Zawahiri, who at the time of this book was published, was the leader of Al-Qaeda. It was after bin Laden had been killed, and he was like bin Laden's second in command. This man died in 2022. Al-Zawahiri was trained for a half a year by the KGB/FSB in Dagestan in 1998. So he was literally this leader in Al-Qaeda, which is now the people who are in charge in Syria following the fall of the Assad regime. As I understand it, it's basically now Al-Qaeda leaders and ISIS leaders. He was trained by the Russians in the late 90s.
And they're saying that the Russian bases, like obviously Putin was supporting Assad, wasn't he? And would you agree that because of the Russians are now stretched in Ukraine, that's probably contributed to Assad's fall, isn't it?
Yeah, I would think so. And it's always, I'm not trying to say that Russia is the only bad actor as far as co-opting or manipulating violent groups in Islam to further their own ends. I have no doubt that the United States has probably done the same thing, like through the CIA or whatever. But it is interesting that this testimony from an insider, Ian Mahai Pachepa, is confirming that there is an alliance of sorts between Russia and Islam, these jihadist groups. I find that fascinating.
Well, I think that's there's some evidence for that in the news this week, where obviously Russia wants to keep their Mediterranean bases in Syria. And even though Assad's been deposed and has fled to Russia, sought asylum in Russia, those bases are still there. So the Russians have maintained that power base for the minute anyway, which that's been commented on over here in the news because there was an expectation that Russia would leave with the failure of the Assad regime. But there's obviously that alliance is obviously there with the new rulers as well, isn't there? There's some link there.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. That's very interesting. And I know that some people claim that there are even Russian connections with ISIS. And again, that could be the case with the United States government as well. I think it's very simplistic and naive to think about it in terms of like one side is 100% evil and the other side is 100% good. You know, there's lots of overlap. There's bad actors on both sides or all sides of things. But
I like it, Matt. And we're Catholic, aren't we? So that's our politics is Catholic. That's the way I always think about it.
Right. And the other point, now that you mentioned that, I wanted to make clear is, I'm not coming on here as some sort of like an apologist for America or something like America is the knight in shining armor that's going to save everything. That's certainly not what I think at all. I think, Soviet Russian ideology is a problem. Islam is a problem. American liberalism is a problem. The only answer to these problems ultimately is Jesus Christ and the Catholic Church that he founded. That's what we need. And that's why I think that, in God's time and by his grace, when Russia truly is consecrated as God through Our Lady has specified, and has this miraculous conversion to Catholic unity, whatever that ends up looking like, that it is going to lead to some sort of restoration, not only of Christendom, but even of the Catholic Church itself, which is in dire need of restoration to her rightful condition, at least in her human element. We're in very dire straits right now.
Yeah, that seems like a wonderful place to end, really. That's absolutely spot on. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for coming on. And if any of you got any questions, following on from this, please do leave a comment. Remember to like and share the video because that really does help us. But if you leave a comment, I'm sure Matt will monitor the comments and perhaps give an answer there. And if there's more information you'd like to hear, I'm sure if we asked really nicely, Matt would come back on and do a part 2. So where can people find you, Matt? Where can they find your talks and?
Some are post like the End of Islam talk. Actually, the full talk is posted on the Fatima Center YouTube channel. So if you go on YouTube and search the Fatima Center, the End of Islam, I'm sure it'll pop up there.
And you're on Twitter X as @MattGaspers, aren't you? So
correct, yeah. I'm also on Facebook, but I do mostly on Twitter. That's where I have a larger following and engage more with people. And then, as I mentioned before, the transcript of this full booklet is available in PDF format on the website of the Fatima Center. So if you just Google Fatima Islam Matt Gasper's Fatima Islam, I know it comes up because that's how I find it myself when I need the link.
Brilliant. So, thanks, Matt. It's absolutely fascinating stuff. Thanks for coming on and sharing it with our audience. And I hope we'll see you again. So thanks, everyone, for watching. Like I say, make sure you click like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And we'll see you on the next episode of Catholic Unscripted. Thanks very much.